Okay, Badri, thank you very much. I thought that was a pretty delightful presentation. Let's hope that the other listeners also feel the same. And I'm happy to invite Bae-Sik, who's joining us here today. Bae-Sik works at Zoom, who's been working quite hard with the explosive growth that they have had in terms of moving towards cloud and having the security follow that paradigm, that the shift that they are going through. So Bae-Sik, welcome. Thank you for being here. Maybe you can give a quick introduction about yourself and your role, and then we can get into the Q&A.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Bae-Sik Chon. I'm employed at Zoom. I'm a security engineer, and I'm glad to be here.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to first start off by asking Badri, as I was going through your presentation, Badri, I think one of the things that hit me is that you kind of have this multiple different things here. You have the DevOps CI/CD pipeline, then you have the CSPM capability, which is related to cloud. Then you have the container capability, which sort of seems a little orthogonal. And it seems like there's a bunch of different tools that are available out there. What do you see when you're talking to customers? What's the value in having these integrated as part of the same platform, or is that sort of immaterial to have them part of the same platform?
Thanks, Sumedh. Excellent question, right? We run into this with customers all the time. From a customer standpoint, if you take everything away, the problem customers struggle with is how do you get to your security outcome? It doesn't matter what tool you're using or how many tools you're using. The advantage with having everything on one platform is you have all the context. So if you take an example like vulnerability management, having cloud posture assessment with something like CloudView and the vulnerabilities in the same place allows you to effectively prioritize those vulnerabilities, for example. So to answer your question, it really is about stitching all this data together and helping the customer get to a particular security outcome.
Okay, good. So Bae-Sik, maybe we can talk, I know you covered a bunch in your presentation, but today you guys have a multi-cloud environment as you are in, in different clouds and expanding quite rapidly. One of the questions that has come in is that given your multi-cloud environment, how does Zoom think about security, and how do you minimize tools and ensure more consistency in your practices across the infrastructure?
Yeah, we have like a multiple cloud environment, but we like to keep it simple, right? So I think whether it's running as AWS instances or Oracle instances, I mean, at the end of the day, it's host running OS and the application, and we want a consistent way of managing the vulnerability across the system. And actually, to be honest with you, when we are evaluating container security, Qualys and but besides Qualys, we are actually looking at the other options. But one of the reasons why we chose, to go with Qualys is because it's the tool that we already know and we already exist. It's already integrated with our other platform, like Splunk and ServiceNow and etc. So, and we already have like a in-house built tools that utilizing the Qualys API. So it makes a lot more sense to just use the same tool. So we spend less time learning about new tools and spending time installing a new tool. Instead, we can using Qualys for the containers security. We can just focus on the problem that we have. So.
Yeah, that always helps because you can get started quickly and less resistance to having to learn new tools and new people managing new tools. So that totally makes sense. So another question that's flowing in, Badri, is as you when you talk to customers, are you seeing conversations happening more with the DevOps team or with the security teams when it comes to shift left? How are you seeing that engagement panning out now over the last year or so?
Yeah, good question, Sumedh. Shift left is certainly the theme with customers because they're realizing it's not just about scanning after the fact. You want to scan in the pipeline. So what we see with customers is that the security teams definitely want this capability so that they can offer this as a DevOps-friendly form factor for their DevOps teams. And Once it gets to actual deployment, then there's much more engagement with the DevOps teams in terms of working through the specifics of the DevOps packaging. Is it a plugin for Jenkins or is it a plugin for Bamboo? If it's a different type of environment, then what kind of scripting would be possible? That's how we see engagement with customers happening both on the security team as well as on the DevOps side.
So who do you see setting up the policy of what should be considered as a passing or failing? I mean, the tooling is one aspect, right? Making sure that the tooling is DevOps friendly, but then the other aspect is the policy of what's good and what's not good.
Yeah, so I think the honest answer there to that question, Sumedh, is one around collaboration. The security teams definitely have the expertise around being able to say what kind of risk posture you need to have and how do you best address that with a gating policy. They might, for example, say CVSS 10 or Qualys QID severity 4 and 5, but it's with the DevOps team that they're actually operationalizing it in case you run into a situation where you do want to push a release out, but there's no patch out for a particular vulnerability. There needs to be a workflow where you can have an exception for that vulnerability. So that's where that collaboration becomes critical, where the security team is setting the policy, but the DevOps team is helping to put in place the workflow that actually works for the application teams.
Okay, thank you for that. So basically, I can turn that towards you. I mean, I'm sure you guys must have crossed that valley and a bunch of battle scars in working with the DevOps team. I'm curious, what have been your learnings with working with the DevOps DevSecOps team, and any thoughts for the audience on how they can do a better job at that?
One of the things that I kind of mentioned during the presentation about Qualys is the inventory, right? With connectors, we get the information about cloud instances and all that. And with that, we can utilize that to make sure that we have agents deployed on all the hosts. And as part of that, once the agents are deployed and start scanning, it knows a lot about information about the host. And one of the such a thing is like information related to container, like for instance, which one is the container host and etc. And using that information, we create like an inventory list of the container host, and then with that information, we were able to talk to DevOps team, and we have with a inventory list in front of us. It's a lot easier for us to talk to them, and then we can, discuss and then prioritize which ones to deploy the sensor first, and which one to deploy next. And using kind of similar kind of information, we can, while during the deploying, we know exact status. On top of that, we provide read access to the DevOps team, so they can actually see the progress themselves, and then they can see once they deploy the sensors, and once it scans, then they can see what kind of vulnerabilities is found, and that actually, so it just become more involved in as the part of the process. I guess one thing that I like to recommend, for other people who are kind of doing the kind of same similar kind of thing is to involve Qualys for early on, and discuss the problem, and then come up with a solution together. But anyway, one of the things that I found out that it was really helpful was that inventory information, and then a lot of queries that we can do to exactly find out where we are, and then the progresses that we are making, and etc.
So it looks like giving visibility to the DevOps team directly also on where you're missing container, where you're missing sensors, etc. So I think that collaborative approach is helping make sure that there is a less resistance, if at all, right? Okay, good. You mentioned something about making sure that all the instances are tracked, etc. I'm curious, how do you guys do that today? How do you ensure that all of the instances that are running in the cloud have the right agents, right tools that you want them to have? Because at the end there is a little bit of that trust but verify approach that needs to be taken as well.
Yeah, I mean, trust and verify. I mean, as you just said, right? The deployment is really the job of ops team, and the way they deploy it is actually they embed all these agents to base image. So as they deploy the cloud instances, with the base image, it's automatically deployed. But of course, so that covers, pretty well. But of course, we want to qualify that. And that's where I guess the inventory, or I guess kind of repeating myself a little bit, is using the connector. I can find out, all those the running instances at any given time, and then I can compare that with against the reports that coming back from the agent, and like agent list, and then I can easily compare that and then find out the gap between the two. And also, like to be honest with you, that's the way we do it for EC2. For Oracle instances, which we also have, it's a little more complicated because connector is not there yet for Oracle. I know it's coming. I heard it's coming pretty soon. But even then, it's not. We just need to extra steps. Like for instance, the way we do it is that we from the Oracle instances, we get using the API, we get all the Oracle instances. And at this time, without connector, there is no direct mapping between what Qualys provides with what Oracle provides, which is not like unlike ECID, which we can map them directly. So OCI-ID is not something that Qualys currently has. But however, since we have a CMDB, I can map information that I get from the OCI instances with the CMDB, and from the CMDB, I get the enough information there to be able to map to the Qualys agents, right? So these are a two-step process, but it helps me to validate all the Oracle instances actually to run with agents in place.
And Badri, I assume you caught the drift. We need to make sure we deliver that OCI connector on time and make sure our agents are picking up the ID as well, because I think that's part of that automation that is really required right at the end of the day. So Badri, one of the things, I'm just paraphrasing from the question that came in, is around container runtime. And one of the things that in sort of the non-cloud, non-containerized workload, there was more of a strict line between the assessment folks and the response folks. And are you seeing that change in any way in the containerized environment, where being able to take response actions, etc., is consolidating more under the same team? Or do you still see that the silos between assessment groups and then response groups, but given the nature and the speed at which containers come up and down, so what are you seeing today?
It's a really interesting question, Sumedh, because if you drill down one level deeper, the promise of containers is one of immutability, right? So ideally, if you build a container, it doesn't really change, it doesn't really drift, it still has a finite attack surface. So your question had two parts, right? On the assessment piece, you're looking for the attack surface, you're trying to minimize it. There still is a finite attack surface which you're trying to protect with the runtime piece. So it's important to have a foot in both worlds, if you will, right? So these two, depending on the type of organization, if they have two teams or if it's one team doing this, they do need to talk to each other, because to be able to do things effectively at runtime, you don't just need a behavioral policy that does enforcement. It doesn't do you any good if you have a million different policies. You're going to slow down the container. What you need to do is, from an assessment standpoint, reduce the attack surface, remove the unused libraries, and then you have a minimal amount of policies, right? So the answer to your question is, it varies depending on the type of the organization, but you do need to look at it holistically, both from managing the attack surface as well as protecting whatever remaining attack surface is there at runtime.
There's a related question to that, and the question is around there's different ways that different security tools seem to be performing when it comes to runtime. There's a sidecar container approach, there's a privileged container approach, there's the instrumentation approach. What are your thoughts on, when it comes more specifically to runtime security, what do you think is better and why?
It's, again, a really interesting question, because customers are asking this exactly every day. From a customer standpoint, customer security teams are faced with a heterogeneity of container environments. You could be running container on-premise, you could be running managed Kubernetes or OpenShift in the public cloud, or you could be running in something like Fargate. The problem with the sidecar-based approaches is that you do need access to the host level. So these approaches don't translate to all of the container environments. So what happens then is when a security team comes up and gives these options to the DevOps teams, it translates to deployment complexity. So one of the reasons why Qualys has chosen the approach it has with its current runtime security offering, as you know, Sumedh, is that we have an approach where we bake in our instrumentation into the image. So the model really is security follows the image. So you do it once, and irrespective of where you deploy the environment, the container itself, security is baked in there. You have visibility in there. Again, there are merits and demerits to each of these approaches, but what we've tried to optimize for is flexibility. So if there's a option that the security team has put in front of the DevOps team, we want there to be as little friction as possible from a deployment standpoint.
Okay. On the topic of containers, Bae-Sik, one of the questions that I have is when it comes to, we know that patching works differently in containers, right? You don't really patch a live container, but when it comes to vulnerability assessment, how are you guys looking at vulnerability assessment on containers different than the vulnerability assessment on hosts? Your standard core OS and your standard host around Red Hat, etc.
Yeah. Cloud agents are like a part of the base image, as I mentioned. So they are automatically deployed. And, container hosts are kind of identified with the cloud agent. And currently we are manually deploying them. So that's a little difference between the two, right? The agents are automatically deployed pretty much. Containers, we actually do it manually. The core difference of the container is really is very dynamic, and that it come and goes fairly much frequently than typical EC2 instances, right? And they are not really likely to following the patching. So it's important for us to kind of look at the image itself and then scan it even before the pre-deployment, before the deployment. Yeah. So and then to identify all those vulnerabilities. Qualys Container Scanner, security helps us to pinpoint back to image and then and then list of the running containers with those vulnerable images to for us to address those quickly. So that helps.
So have you seen a lot of value in? There's a mix between containers assessment for vulnerabilities on the CI/CD side versus current drift tracking on the runtime side, and I guess depending on how long running your containers are, how do you look at that, right? Do you see that container vulnerability assessment should really just be done in the CI/CD pipeline, or do you see doing some basic assessment at runtime is also helpful to track drift?
Say one more time. I'm sorry.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was saying that today when you are looking at vulnerability assessment for containers, it's mainly focused on images, right? So the question I have is there value in tracking drift of those containers at runtime to check if they have changed in their posture from a vulnerability assessment perspective, or just focusing on the CI/CD is good enough?
Oh yeah. In the runtime is also important. I mean, there are chances that there are on the slide there could be a chance of something getting modified, and it's definitely a best practice and also one of the compliance requirements. So it really helps us to track the activities on the containers, and in case of if there is any instance, it really helps us with the investigation.
Okay, so Badri, another aspect here is of the multi-cloud environment. So I think it's interesting. Obviously, Zoom has a multi-cloud environment. Are you seeing that trend more with organizations growing in that direction, or is it more that they standardize on one cloud and mostly stick with that?
So when people talk about multi-cloud, Sumedh, there's often the conception that you could have one application running across infrastructure on all different clouds. That's not something we see a whole lot of with customers. Typically, the scenario we see with customers is that different lines of businesses or different organizational units within the company have actually chosen various cloud providers for various reasons. So one example could be the lines of businesses could be running their applications on something like AWS, whereas the IT team could have picked Azure for some of their Microsoft workloads. And then there's a research team that's picked something like Google Cloud for its machine learning capabilities, right? So companies are making the best choice of infrastructure based on their needs. And security teams, what they end up having to deal with is if you have these different choices of infrastructure, then how can I have a consistent security tooling and a security process where I can address all of these heterogeneity of public cloud environments?
And I think as you have multiple clouds, I think each of these clouds are now providing some sort of a managed container runtime. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that to say, what's the managed runtime differences, and just in terms of security, is there anything additional that customers should think about when they look at Fargate or something like that to run containers rather than having their own Docker host, etc.?
Sure, Sumedh. So one obvious point, if you look at these different choices of container infrastructure, if you run a container on something like straight up Docker or even on your own Kubernetes cluster, it does have the operational overhead of having to manage that infrastructure. You have to manage that host, you have to manage that Kubernetes cluster, which means from a security standpoint, you have to patch it and so on. If you're using a managed version of, let's say, orchestration like something like AKS or EKS in Amazon, the advantage is you don't have to manage that from an operational standpoint. From a security standpoint, you don't have to take care of it as well, right? Because the cloud provider is taking care of that, keeping that up to date. But it's a world of shared responsibility. You still need to track your container drift that you talked about. You do need to look at your behaviors that are inside your containers. So it really depends on what flavor of containers you're running and what part of the infrastructure you're managing or not managing.
Okay. So basic question for you. So as you guys are pushing out more containers and you see runtime container security as you expand more into that, how do you see that working? Like what kind of things would you want to do when it comes to assessing security and protection for your runtime environments?
Yeah, so I guess that we just continuously run the scanning and then try to understand run the scan and then find out the vulnerabilities. And once we find out, make sure that we look at the vulnerability and make sure that it is valid, and then go from there. As I mentioned, this runtime is scanning the runtime environment is best practice, and also is one of the things that we need to do. So we continue to do that. Yeah.
Okay, Badri, I think we're coming up on our time. Any last things that you want to mention, maybe that you didn't cover in your presentation, apart from the fact that OCI support is coming very soon?
So again, we went through a lot of things in my presentation. There's a lot of supplementing detail that are in the breakout sessions where we'll go into much more detail on all the things that were covered. So I highly recommend the audience check those out.
Yeah, I think the breakout sessions look very, very good. We're going to have those, the couple ones that are from Alex and Chon, I think, seem very interesting. So I do want to thank you, Badri, for the presentation, and Bae-Sik, thank you very much. Congratulations on all the explosive growth that Zoom has had, and looking forward to working closely with you on some of the newer challenges that you have around security with your cloud and container environment.